The silence of deep space had become Marcus Vale's closest companion over the past 8 years. The abandoned research station orbited a dead moon, its corridors echoing only with the hum of life support systems and his own footsteps. Once, this place had buzzed with the excitement of discovery. Teams of scientists studying the mysterious energy readings from the nearby Helix Nebula. Now it served as a sanctuary, a place where he could work on his engineering projects without the weight of memories pressing down on him. Marcus was elbow-deep in the guts of a malfunctioning atmospheric processor when the proximity alarms shattered his solitude. The harsh klaxon echoed through the empty halls, a sound he hadn't heard in 3 years. He paused, wrench in hand, assuming it was another salvage ship looking to strip parts from the station's more valuable equipment. Such visits were rare, but not unheard of. The scanner readings on his portable display made him freeze. The ship's signature was elegant, streamlined, bearing the distinctive energy patterns of Celestian royal vessels. His heart began to race as old wounds tore open. There was only one person who might come looking for him in such a ship. Only one reason someone would travel to this forgotten corner of space. Marcus set down his tools with trembling hands and made his way to the main docking bay. Through the reinforced viewport, he watched the graceful vessel complete its landing sequence. The hull was a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb the station's harsh lighting, adorned with silver filigree that traced complex patterns across its surface. Even in his emotional turmoil, the engineer in him admired the craftsmanship. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss, and 2 figures emerged first. They weren't the heavily armored guards he expected, but rather individuals in flowing ceremonial robes that marked them as palace advisors. Their presence suggested this was no casual visit. Then she appeared. Nyx Solaria stepped through the airlock with a dignity that took Marcus's breath away. Gone was the frightened girl who had once tried to make herself invisible. This woman moved with purpose, her chin raised, shoulders back, beside the subtle asymmetry in her gait that he remembered so well. Her skin, that unique pale silver that had made her an outcast among her own people, now seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Her hair, once hidden beneath concealing hoods, fell in waves of starlight silver down her back, but it was her eyes that truly stopped him, those distinctive violet orbs that had once held such pain and resignation now blazed with determination and strength. She wore robes of deep purple silk that complemented her coloring perfectly, the fabric flowing around her in a way that didn't hide her differences, but celebrated them. The advisors took positions on either side of her, but she gestured for them to remain by the ship. Her approach was unhurried, each step deliberate and confident. The limp was still there, her right leg bearing less weight than the left, but she no longer tried to disguise it. Instead, she moved with a rhythm uniquely her own. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the musical tones of her people, but with a resonance that spoke of command, of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with his memories. The frightened girl, who had once whispered apologies for existing, had transformed into someone radiant with self-possession. "Your Majesty," he managed, the formal address feeling strange on his tongue. He started to bow, the protocol drilled into him during his years in the space engineering course, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Do you remember me, Marcus?" she asked, and for just a moment, vulnerability flickered across her features. "The broken girl who clung to your kindness like a lifeline?" The words hit him like a physical blow. Of course he remembered. Every detail of those 7 days was burned into his memory. The way she had flinched from shadows, how her eyes had lit up when he'd shown genuine interest in her culture, the feel of her hand in his as she'd finally learned to trust. "I remember," he said quietly. "You were never broken, Nyx. You were the strongest person I'd ever met." Her lips curved into a smile that transformed her entire face. You were the only one who saw me that way. The only one who chose me when everyone else looked through me, as if I were invisible. The past seemed to crystallize in the space between them. 8 years ago, the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Initiative had been the galaxy's attempt at fostering understanding between humans and the various alien species they'd encountered. Participants would spend a week in carefully designed habitats, learning about each other's ways of life. Marcus had volunteered for reasons he'd never fully understood himself. Fresh out of his engineering certification program, he'd been drawn by curiosity rather than any diplomatic agenda. The program matched participants based on personality assessments and compatibility algorithms. But Marcus remembered the selection day vividly. The holding area had been filled with representatives from a dozen different species, all waiting to be chosen by human participants. Most gravitated toward the more impressive specimens, the towering Drachmori with their reptilian grace, the luminescent Etherians, who seemed to glow from within, the fierce Warian fighters, whose very presence commanded respect. Nyx had been sitting alone in a corner, her small frame hunched beneath concealing robes. Even then, Marcus had been struck by how she seemed to take up as little space as possible, as if apologizing for her very existence. When their eyes had met briefly, he'd seen intelligence there, and pain, and a resignation that had cut him to the core. The program coordinator had tried to dissuade him. That one's Celestian royalty, the man had said with barely concealed disdain. Some kind of genetic anomaly they're trying to pawn off for political points. Her bloodline's considered cursed. You'd be doing yourself a favor to choose someone else. But Marcus had watched as other humans passed her by, some with open disdain, others with uncomfortable pity. The way her shoulders had drawn tighter with each rejection had made his decision for him now. Standing before him 8 years later, she was clearly no longer the discarded princess who had been hidden away from public view. The confidence in her bearing, the way her advisors deferred to her, the very fact that she commanded a royal vessel, everything spoke of dramatic change. Why now? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. After all this time, why? Did you come looking for me? Nyx moved closer, her steps sure despite her uneven gait. Because the galaxy is changing, Marcus. The old ways, the old prejudices, they're crumbling. And because... She paused, her violet eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Because I never forgot the man who saw worth in someone everyone else deemed worthless. She gestured toward the viewport where her ship waited. I have a proposition for you. One that could change both our worlds. Marcus felt the walls he'd built around his heart over 8 long years beginning to crack. The woman before him was no longer the frightened girl he'd fallen in love with, but somehow, looking into her eyes, he could still see her there beneath the surface. The same brilliant mind, the same gentle soul, now armored in the strength that came from surviving and thriving despite all odds. What kind of proposition? He asked, though part of him already knew that whatever she offered, whatever impossible dream she carried with her across the void, he would find it hard to refuse. Not when she looked at him like that, not when she carried herself with such magnificent defiance of everyone who had ever tried to diminish her. The space between them seemed to hum with possibility, with the weight of shared history and the promise of futures yet unwritten. 8 years of silence hung in the air, waiting to be broken by whatever words would come next. The Cultural Exchange Station had been a marvel of diplomatic engineering, a neutral space where beings from different worlds could meet safely. Marcus remembered walking through its pristine corridors, past observation lounges where other human alien pairs were already getting acquainted. The nervous energy in the air was palpable, a mixture of excitement and apprehension that marked most first contact situations. The selection chamber was vast, its walls curved to create an amphitheater effect. Representatives from 12 different species waited in designated areas, each group displaying their unique characteristics. The Drakmori delegation stood tall and proud, their scaled skin catching the light. The Etherians seemed to float, rather, than walk, their translucent bodies pulsing with soft bioluminescence. The Warian contingent radiated barely contained aggression, muscles rippling beneath their ceremonial armor. And then there were the Celestians. Most of them were stunning examples of their species, tall, graceful beings with rich purple skin that seemed to contain galaxies within its depths. Their hair ranged from deep violet to silver, and their eyes held the wisdom of a people who had mastered interstellar travel before humans had discovered fire. They carried themselves with an otherworldly elegance that made many humans stop and stare in wonder, all except one. Nyx sat apart from her delegation, hunched in the corner like she was trying to become invisible. Her concealing robes were plain gray, instead of the elaborate garments worn by the other Celestians. Marcus could see little of her except for pale hands, clasped tightly in her lap, and the occasional glimpse of silver hair when she shifted position. Tragic case, that one, Marcus overheard another human saying to his companion. Beautiful species, but genetics can be cruel anywhere in the galaxy. Heard she's some kind of royal embarrassment they're trying to quietly dispose of. Marcus felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty in the man's voice. He watched as potential partners approached the Celestian group, inevitably drawn to the more impressive specimens. Each time someone passed Nyx without a glance, he saw her shoulders draw tighter. When a particularly loud human made a joke about damaged goods within her hearing, Marcus saw her flinch as if physically struck. The casual cruelty of it made his decision for him. He approached her slowly, noting how she tensed at his footsteps. When he crouched down to meet her eye level, she looked up with such startled surprise that it broke his heart. "Hello," he said gently. "I'm Marcus Vale. Wood. You consider partnering with me for the exchange program?" Her violet eyes went wide, searching his face for signs of mockery or pity. When she found neither, confusion replaced suspicion. "You single quotes serious." Her voice was barely above a whisper, musical even in its uncertainty, completely serious. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze intelligent and penetrating despite her obvious nervousness. "Why?" The question was direct, vulnerable, and deserved an honest answer. "Because everyone deserves to be chosen," Marcus said simply. "And because I'm more interested in getting to know you than in making an impression on anyone else." Something shifted in her expression, hope warring with years of ingrained expectation of rejection. Slowly, she nodded. "I am Nyx," she said, deliberately omitting any titles. I would be honored to participate with you." The habitat assigned to them was a masterpiece of adaptive design. The structure itself was modest, living quarters, a common area, and basic amenities, but the environment surrounding it was split down the middle. One half replicated a section of earth forest, complete with oak trees, ferns, and a babbling brook. The other half mimicked the crystal gardens of Celesta, with towering formations that caught and refracted light in impossible ways. The first day was an exercise in careful politeness and mutual uncertainty. Nyx moved through the space like she was afraid of disturbing anything, her limp more pronounced when she thought he wasn't watching. She'd chosen the Celestian side for her sleeping quarters, but spent most of her time in the common area between worlds. Marcus filled the awkward silences by explaining his work, pointing out the engineering marvels that made their temporary home possible. The atmospheric processors can actually analyze your biological needs and adjust the air composition in real time, he said, gesturing to nearly invisible vents in the ceiling. Fascinating, Nyx replied, though her tone suggested she was being polite rather than genuinely interested. It wasn't until he mentioned the crystal formations that her demeanor changed. "These are poor imitations," she said, approaching one of the larger structures and running her fingers along its surface. "On Celesta, they're living things, growing and changing over millennia." "Living?" Marcus moved closer. "His engineers." Curiosity piqued. For the first time, passion entered her voice. "They respond to emotional resonance, to the thoughts and feelings of those around them. During the Festival of Three Moons, when the entire population gathers in the royal gardens, the crystals sing." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "The harmony they create is said to echo the music of creation itself." "That sounds incredible," Marcus said, and meant it. "Could you tell me more about how they work?" She turned to him, surprise clear on her face. "You truly want to know?" "Of course. I've studied crystal matrices in energy applications, but nothing like what you're describing." That night, they each retired to their separate quarters, but Marcus lay awake, thinking about the wonder in her voice when she'd spoken of her homeworld. Through the thin walls, he could hear soft sounds from her room, not quite crying, but the quiet breathing of someone fighting back tears. The second day brought tentative progress. Nyx emerged from her quarters wearing slightly less concealing clothing, though she still favored garments that hid her asymmetrical leg. Marcus had spent the night sketching, designed ideas for a device that might replicate some aspect of the crystal singing she described. "What are you working on?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve as she watched him assemble components on the common room table. "A resonance amplifier," Marcus replied, not looking up from his delicate work. "Based on what you told me about your crystals. It won't be anything like the real thing, but maybe it can create an echo of what you described." Her intake of breath was sharp. "You were listening. Really listening. Every word." She moved closer, her limp forgotten in her fascination with his work. The harmonic frequencies would need to be calibrated to celestian neural patterns, she sighed, leaning over his shoulder. And the crystal matrix would require a bioresponsive component to truly sing. Marcus paused in his assembly, looking up at her. "You understand the technical aspects?" A flush of deeper purple colored her pale cheeks. "I studied bioengineering before ... She gestured vaguely at herself. "Before it became clear that my physical limitations made me unsuitable for palace roles." "What kind of bioengineering?" "Crystal cultivation and harmonics. I was working on applications for healing and mood regulation before my family decided my research was another embarrassment to be hidden away." Marcus stared at her, pieces clicking into place. "You're brilliant." The compliment seemed to startle her more than any kindness he'd shown yet. "I'm defective," she said automatically, the response clearly programmed by years of hearing it. "No," Marcus said firmly, "you're brilliant. And anyone who can't see, that is the one with the defect." That evening, when his crude device managed to coax a faint, ethereal hum from one of the artificial crystals, Nyx smiled for the first time since he'd met her. The expression transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with joy shared. The third day marked a turning point. Nyx began asking questions about Earth, about his life before the exchange program. Marcus found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone, about growing up during humanity's first forays into galactic society, about his fascination with alien technologies, about the sense of wonder that had driven him to become an engineer. "Were you disappointed?" she asked as they walked along the border between their two environments. "When you discovered that space travel is more mechanical than magical?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but then you encounter something that reminds you why you started looking up at the stars in the first place, like right now." "Right now?" "Watching you explain crystal harmonics yesterday, seeing the passion in your eyes when you talk about bioengineering, That's the magic I was looking for. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. You find my interest ... compelling? I find you compelling, Marcus said, the honesty slipping out before he could stop it. Nix's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope. I don't understand you, Marcus Vale. Your people could have chosen any of my delegation. Keth Valorian is considered one of the most accomplished warriors of his generation. Zara Moonweave is a renowned artist whose crystal sculptures grace the finest museums on 3 worlds. Instead, you chose the royal mistake. I chose you, Marcus said simply. Not because of your title or in spite of your differences, but because when I looked at you, I saw someone worth knowing. That night, he heard her crying again, but the sound was different somehow. Not the quiet desperation of the first night, but something that sounded almost like relief. On the 4th day, Marcus found her attempting to bathe in the small lake that bordered both environments. She'd removed her outer robes, but remained clothed, struggling to maintain her balance on the moss-covered rocks with her unsteady gait. Would you like some help? He called from a respectful distance. She froze, humiliation coloring her features. I don't require assistance. It's not about requiring it, Marcus said carefully. Sometimes it's just nice to have someone steady. Would you let me help? After a long hesitation, she nodded. Marcus approached slowly, offering his arm for balance. Up close, he could see that her right leg was noticeably smaller than her left, the muscle development uneven. Her ankle turned at an unusual angle, and he realized she'd been born with a condition that her people's advanced medicine hadn't been able to fully correct. He helped her to a comfortable depth in the water, then began to withdraw, as promised. Marcus, she called softly. He turned back. Thank you for treating me like a person instead of a problem. The vulnerability in her voice made his chest tighten. You are a person, Nix, and remarkable one. As he walked away, Marcus found himself already dreading the end of their 7 days together. Something was growing between them, something neither had expected to find in this sterile diplomatic exercise. Something that felt real in a way that scared him with its intensity. The 5th day brought an unexpected vulnerability that would change everything between them. Marcus found Nix standing at the edge of the lake, staring at her reflection with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache. I'm not what a Celestian should be, she said without turning around, having sensed his approach. Our people are known for their ethereal beauty, their graceful movements, their radiant skin that holds the light of stars. I am pale where I should be vibrant, clumsy where I should be elegant. Marcus moved to stand beside her, studying their twin reflections in the still water. On Earth, we have an ancient art form called kintsugi, he said quietly. When pottery breaks, artisans repair it with gold, making the cracks part of the beauty rather than hiding them. She turned to look at him, confusion in her violet eyes. They believe that something broken and mended is more beautiful than something that was never damaged at all. Marcus continued. The gold doesn't hide the break. It celebrates survival. Your people have strange philosophies about beauty. Nix whispered. Maybe we just understand that perfection is less interesting than resilience, he replied, meeting her gaze. Less compelling than courage. That night, she was restless, tossing with what sounded like nightmares. Marcus heard her soft cries through the walls, and without thinking, went to her. He found her curled in her bed, trembling from whatever visions had gripped her sleeping mind. Nix, he said gently, touching her shoulder. You're safe. It's just a dream. Her eyes flew open, wide with terror that slowly focused on his face. They were sending me to the exile towers again, she whispered, her voice small and broken. The place where they keep the genetic failures, hidden from sight. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, his heart breaking for the fear in her voice. You're not there. You're here with me." She reached out suddenly, grasping his hand with fingers that trembled. "When these 7 days end, I'll have to return to that reality, to being the mistake they wish they could erase." Marcus had no words for this truth, so he simply held her hand until her breathing steadied and sleep reclaimed her. But he didn't return to his own room. Instead, he spent the night in the chair beside her bed, keeping watch over her dreams. The 6th day dawned with artificial sunlight streaming through the habitat's environmental controls. Marcus woke to find Nix sitting up in bed, watching him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You stayed," she said, wonder in her voice. "You seemed like you needed someone to watch over you," Marcus replied, stretching the kinks from his neck. "I didn't mind." She was quiet for a long moment, then slipped from the bed with more grace than he'd seen from her before. "I want to show you something," she said, moving to her travel case and withdrawing a small, crystalline device. "What is it?" Marcus asked, accepting the object. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with inner light. "A memory crystal," Nix explained, settling beside him on the bed. "Celestians use them to preserve important experiences. This one contains recordings from the royal gardens during the Festival of 3 Moons." She activated the device with a defiance. Touch, and suddenly the room filled with the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. It wasn't quite music, more like the crystallized essence of harmony itself, complex layers of tone that seemed to resonate in his bones. "This is what I was trying to describe," Nix said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "The song of my homeworld, the beauty I'll never see again." Marcus listened, overwhelmed by the haunting melody. "Why will you never see it again?" "Because after this program ends, I'll be exiled permanently to the outer colonies. My participation here was meant to be my final diplomatic service before disappearing forever." The weight of her words settled between them like a physical presence. Marcus realized that these 7 days weren't just a cultural exchange for her. They were a goodbye to everything she'd ever known. "That's not right," he said, anger rising on her behalf. "You're not damaged goods to be discarded?" Nix turned to him, something fierce breaking through her usual resignation. "No, it's not." "Right, but it's the reality I was born into." She moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "These days with you, Marcus, they're the first time in my life I've been treated as a person rather than a problem to be managed." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Marcus found himself studying the delicate features of her face, the way her pale skin seemed to shimmer like moonlight, the intelligence that blazed in her unusual eyes. "Nix," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I know this is temporary," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "I know that when we leave here, we'll return to our separate worlds. But right now, in this moment, could you help me forget what I am and remember who I might be?" The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. Her lips were soft against his, tasting faintly of the alien fruits they'd shared at dinner. When they parted, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've never," she began, then stopped, color rising in her pale cheeks. "Neither have I," Marcus admitted. "Not like this. Not with someone who matters." What followed was an exploration of tenderness that transcended the physical. Marcus's hands were reverent as they traced the curve of her shoulder, the line of her neck. She trembled beneath his touch, not from fear, but from the overwhelming experience of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. When her fingers fumbled with unfamiliar human clothing, he guided her gently, patient and unhurried. There was no rush, no urgency beyond the need to show her how precious she was in the soft light of the habitat's evening cycle. She finally allowed herself to be completely vulnerable. The twisted leg, The pale skin that marked her as different from her people. All the imperfections that had made her an outcast were revealed without shame. "You're beautiful," Marcus told her, meaning every word. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Even this?" she asked, gesturing to her malformed leg. "Especially that," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her knee, "because it's part of you." When they came together, it was with a reverence that made the act sacred. She gasped, not from discomfort, but from the emotional intensity of true connection. As they moved as one, her tears fell freely, not from pain but from joy, from the revelation that she could be loved completely, differences and all. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. The sound seemed to fascinate her, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin in rhythm with the steady pulse. "In Celestian culture," she said drowsily, "we believe that hearts that beat in harmony are destined souls finding each other across the cosmos." Marcus pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "What happens to destined souls when the cosmos pulls them apart?" "According to legend, they find each other again," she whispered, "no matter how many lifetimes it takes." Their final day arrived with the artificial dawn, harsh and unforgiving in its finality. Marcus woke to find Nyx already up, standing at the viewport that showed her royal transport approaching. She donned her concealing robes again, the transformation. Back to Hidden Princess already beginning. "My escort arrives in 2 hours," she said without turning around. Marcus joined her at the viewport, watching the elegant ship grow larger against the star field. "I wish there was another way. There isn't." Her voice carried the flat acceptance of someone who had learned not to hope for impossible things. "This was beautiful, Marcus. More beautiful than I ever dared imagine. But beautiful things end." He wanted to argue, to propose wild solutions, that she could stay, that he could go with her, that love could somehow overcome the vast differences in their social positions. But they both understood the reality. She was royalty, however. Unwanted, he was a human engineer with no status, no power to protect her from the political forces that controlled her life. "Will you remember me?" he asked instead, the question more vulnerable than he'd intended. She turned from the viewport, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I will carry you with me like a star carries its own light," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me something I never had before." "What's that?" "The knowledge that I am worthy of love." When the royal escort arrived, Nyx had fully reassumed her public persona. Back straight despite her limp, face composed and distant, she allowed herself to be led away by Celestian guards, who treated her with cold politeness rather than respect. Only once did she look back, her violet eyes meeting his across the docking. "Bay." In that glance, he saw everything they'd shared, everything they were losing, and a promise that somehow, someday, they would find each other again. Marcus stood at the viewport long after her ship had disappeared into hyperspace, his reflection, staring back at him from the dark glass. In his quarters, he found a small memory crystal on his pillow, her recording of the Festival of 3 Moons, left as a parting gift. That night, as the haunting harmonies filled his empty room, Marcus made a decision that would define the next 8 years of his life. He requested transfer to the most remote posting the engineering corps could offer, choosing exile over the possibility of moving on and forgetting. Some loves, he realized, were worth preserving in solitude rather than allowing the world to taint them with compromise. Now, 8 years later, standing before the woman she'd become, Marcus felt those carefully buried emotions surge back to life. The frightened girl was gone, replaced by someone magnificent in her own power. But in her eyes, he could still see traces of the soul that had touched his so deeply. "Your proposition," he said, his voice rough with memory. "Tell me what you need." Nyx stepped closer, close enough that he could see the silver flecks in her violet eyes, close enough to catch the familiar scent that belonged only to her. I need you to come home with me, Marcus. Not as my engineer or my advisor, but as something far more important. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. I need you to be my partner in rebuilding a world that has forgotten how to value anything beyond conventional perfection. The weight of her words settled between them, heavy with possibility and fraught with the same impossibilities that had separated them before. But looking into her eyes, Marcus saw something different this time. Not resignation, but determination. Not a princess begging for mercy, but a leader offering partnership. And if I say yes? He asked. Then we face the future together, she replied, her voice steady and sure. Whatever it may bring.